Financial technology has transformed our lives, from splitting bills to buying stocks and shares. It's never been easier, faster, or cheaper to send money around the world. You can even buy a car with your watch. That was sci-fi when I was a kid. Sadly, the future never arrived for the way we pay people, which remains slow, time-consuming, and expensive. Which is kind of amazing, because there are 3.5 billion workers in the world, and all of them need to get paid. That's just about the biggest market there is. So why hasn't it been disrupted? Well, because it's complicated. When I send money to someone as a consumer, the transaction is pretty straightforward. But as a business, with thousands of employees in dozens of countries, payments get complex really quickly. Let's say I operate in 30 countries. Okay, that's 30 different sets of labour laws to comply with, all with their own curious little quirks around pensions and taxes. If I'm lucky, a bunch of those countries will share a currency, like in the Eurozone, but chances are, many won't. So that's a whole bunch of foreign exchange I have to organise and pay for. To do that, I need partner banks who all speak different languages, work in different time zones, and all have different attitudes to, well, banking. Some are good, efficient, and digitised, and some are not. It's a stunning amount of manual work for finance and HR teams. In fact, 30% of companies say that manual work is the most time-consuming part of payroll, according to research by Deloitte. And let's not even get started on financial compliance. Because if you mess up a payment for a consumer, you can usually fix it with a phone call. But if you mess up a payment that involves the government, things can get nasty pretty quickly. We're talking millions of dollars in fines. And banks can't protect you from those kinds of mistakes. Banks are great, but they're not payroll specialists, and they can't help you if you've miscalculated payments to, say, the IRS. Well, here's the good news. The fintech revolution is finally here for payroll payments. Here's Johnny Nash, a pro with a decade of experience in the payments game. He's going to explain how things like same-day delivery and automation are revolutionizing the way that global companies pay their workers. Over to Jessica and Johnny.
Thanks, Alex. So, Johnny, what's a land date and why is it so important?
So land date is when employees receive their funds. Ultimately, if you don't pay people on pay date, nothing has more of an effect on your employee well-being than people being paid on time, right? If people can't pay their bills, their mortgage, feed their children, feed their families, then they're going to be very unhappy, and that's going to affect the company in more ways than just that. Payroll is a zero-tolerance game in that sense.
And yet, I can transfer money to any corner of the world almost instantaneously. So why is it not the same for payroll payments?
Payroll payments are tough. Each country has its own regulation, its own legislation that you have to abide by. Every country has its own bank detail requirements. And again, we're dealing with the most emotional payments relating to payroll. So it's absolutely key. But now mentioning things like regulation payments, so things like tax, social security, pensions, third-party payments, again, those have to be paid in certain ways, country to country, whether that be direct debit, whether that be a local wire, whether that be from the client's own account. Those key things are absolutely fundamental to being compliant and making sure you don't have huge penalties, fines and charges associated with either a late payment or a payment being classified in the wrong way.
So what is that complexity costing the company?
So if you think about a company that has 10 countries potentially, managing 10 different time frames of when employees are due, when taxes are due, when social security is due, that's very, very difficult if you don't have a technology that can ultimately underpin that and provide you with those specific dates and times country to country.
So on the one hand, there's a lot of complex processes that have to take place. On the other hand, it's all still very manual. Why is that?
So I think when you're dealing with the most emotional and sensitive payments in the world, which are payroll payments, people want to double check, triple check manually.
And they face that every month, that risk cycle.
Exactly. Payroll doesn't take a holiday, right?
Mm-hmm. So if you've got all these manual processes, how do you get to see a bigger picture in all of these, the data that's managed under these processes?
So technology has to play a huge part in that. Ultimately, payroll has gone through a change over the last 20 to 30 years, and so have payments. You think about how you used to get paid 20, 30 years ago, many people were paid by cash. Nowadays, everyone gets paid into their bank account. There's new and novel ways like wallets and all sorts of things like that where people are looking to consume their pay. But again, all of us have changed our habits on the back of COVID.
Data standardization must be a massive undertaking when you're also thinking about the world. What does that look like?
So whether it be an IBAN across Europe, those lengths differ country to country. Whether you're paying into India, so you need an IFSC code, which is a local routing number, and all sorts of things like that. But ultimately there are key fundamentals that people need, which is things like employee name, bank account name, address. So there is an element of globalization of master data for sure. And then there's what's called local data or global data, as we like to call it, which is for your payroll data and your payroll payment data.
Making that global universal sounds like another colossal challenge.
Exactly, and if you don't have a global technology that manages that and can consolidate that all into a single view for you, and also validate that. It's all well and good having data, but bad data can be more of a problem than it can be a solving solution. And the problem with that is if a payment's rejected or it's been sent and then it's stuck with a bank, it can be stuck for days, weeks and months without actually understanding where those funds are. And that can cost companies a huge amount of time, effort, money and resources.
Can you tell me a little bit about the combination of processing payroll and actually executing payroll payments? It seems like it's been separated as processes within an organization, but wouldn't that make it more efficient to be conjoined?
I always say if you walk down the street and ask someone what does payroll mean, no one would split the calculation from the payment. Yet many companies do that time and time again. I think again it comes back to that whole point of control. People believe still to this day that having them manually check these things means they have more control and it can be more efficient.
So if a company wanted to be more efficient and bring these two processes together, what would that look like?
Investing in global technology is absolutely key and fundamental to the success of any kind of global process, but especially payroll. Allowing you to have a central source for your data, a central source to validate all that data, and then a key process where you have ultimately a system that allows you to track that data, the accuracy of the data and the calculations, all the way through to the payments is absolutely key.
But payroll payments being so complex, what does it mean to have custom payment rails for payroll?
It's a compliance element, which is the absolute key. So it's understanding how the payments have to be processed legally from a legislative perspective, country to country. It's understanding when a payment has to be issued for the land date to be executed. Again, we're not talking about paying a family member across overseas. If you receive that a day late, it's not the end of the world. You kind of text them and say, look, I'm sorry, you're going to get it a day later than you originally thought. If you got that text as an employee to say, by the way, you're getting your pay a day late, you'd be pretty unhappy, right?
Why are payment rails for payroll so different than your traditional banking rails?
So a bank is ultimately reactive, whereas a global technology that's specific for payroll payments can be way more proactive in its kind of checks and balances. So one, things like validation, two, the consolidation of that data, but three, the understanding of the local compliance, when payments have to be processed, when they have to be credited, and also understanding the importance. There's some good examples where tax legislation has changed. So in France, tax legislation has changed where payments now have to be paid via direct debit from a bank account either in France or within the SEPA region. So no longer can you send a wire from internationally and that payment just be processed. We're actually seeing tax authorities now reject those payments. So again, you can of course adapt technology, but it's understanding and keeping up to date with that local legislation and legislative changes. That's why the fintech bubble has boomed, right? Mm-hmm. We have a fintech bubble that is just exploding more and more across the world. And that's because banks are there to be reactive, whereas people are building solutions day in, day out, which are more proactive and providing better solutions across the board.
How will banks continue to fit in this picture?
Everyone needs a bank some way or the other. Ultimately, it's about what technology you build over the bank. And that's the key here. So ultimately, having banking regulations, you'll have to use a bank to process the payments.
Why is FX fees so expensive, and how can a global company take a little bit more control over that?
The key is about transparency and visibility again. So having a global technology will allow you to have that transparency and visibility into seeing what the exact exchange rate is at this point in time. Again, with a bank, you won't see that until post-transaction. The other thing as well is when you have a global payroll and payments technology, it allows you to forecast more effectively. So you can forecast your payrolls more. It means you can be more efficient with your cash. Your finance team then can be way more kind of way more forward thinking with probably the biggest expense a company has, which is payroll.
And the scalability around for FX fees and all that overhead can really add up quickly.
Yeah, and it's about, again, having a proactive partner that can give you good conversation and educate you on what's the best kind of process.
Let's talk about same day and instant payments. Is that really possible?
In some countries, yes. In some countries, no. It all comes down to, again, the payment that you have to process. So we're moving in a world where everyone wants to consume things quicker and easier and more instant than ever. So there are things like faster payments in the UK, which is an instant credit mechanism. There's instant SEPA across the Euro region, again, where people are adopting. But it comes down to each bank has to adopt that for payments to be able to be processed in that way. Everyone wants to move to instant. We all want to move to instant. I do. Everyone does, but it comes back to, is that the right thing for payroll compliance, and can that be done effectively?
What's next for the future of payroll and payments?
I think it's using dedicated technology to ultimately fulfill these payments in a more efficient way. The other thing I would say is employees are now driving the market. So pre-COVID, companies could kind of do what they wanted and pay how they wanted, whereas we're now in a very much employee-driven world. So employees are determining how they want to be paid country to country. They're driving that change on when pay is consumed and how it's consumed. So I think we'll see new and different ways of paying people appear in the world in the next couple of years. But ultimately, the key for any company is streamlining your processes, making sure you have a global infrastructure, making sure you have that streamlined effect to process all of those payroll payments in an efficient way. Zero tolerance is absolutely key for payroll. You cannot afford to pay people or taxes or anything late, and that's the challenge.
Thanks, Johnny. And thank you for joining us today.